Thank you, Chairman. To Chairman Claggett, Vice Chair Workman, Ranking Member Mohammed, and members of the House Technology and Innovation Committee, thank you for this opportunity to provide interested party testimony on amended House Bill 78. My name is Gary Daniels. I am here representing the ACLU of Ohio. I will confess from a privacy standpoint, the ACLU of Ohio will likely never be comfortable with the use of digital IDs. However, we also recognize many states are moving this direction and many people support this advance in technology and convenience. So for now, the ACLU of Ohio is interested party instead of opponent on HB 78 with the sincere hope this bill can be improved in ways that respect and reflect civil liberties concerns. The ACLU of Ohio's main concern with HB 78 is the lack of specific privacy protections in the bill for your constituents. Indeed, any adequate privacy protections, assuming ones would eventually emerge, are entrusted via HB 78 to the Bureau of Motor Vehicles to develop, implement, and administer a program for the creation and use of digital IDs. And while it is true HB 78 also tasks the BMV with, quote, any other procedures or requirements that the registrar determines are necessary to implement and administer this section and ensure the general privacy, security, and safety of the data and images exchanged through the program, our fear is whatever is ultimately implemented and used will be inadequate to protect privacy, as has been the case in other states that have gone down this path. In other words, the ACLU of Ohio believes and requests that adequate privacy protections be specifically included in the language of HB 78 instead of leaving it to a different entity in the future where the process, deliberations, and ability to impact the outcome are far less transparent and accessible. More specifically, these are some of, but not all by any means, of the minimal privacy protections the ACLU of Ohio believes are crucial to this type of legislation and effort. Number one, the tracking of digital ID users. The same convenience digital IDs will provide for Ohioans will also make it much more convenient for people to be tracked, with no limits across multiple additional entities and uses. HB 78 should ensure the data generated by and online movements of digital ID holders cannot be tracked and stored by government and any third-party data brokers responsible for the operation of digital ID systems for purposes other than those specifically needed for the intended use of a digital ID. The use of digital IDs should not subject your constituents to tracking across multiple uses and purposes, exposing our whereabouts, purchases, transactions, and other uses that are possible via a digital ID, but not with a current hard copy ID. In addition, this prohibition should apply not just to the BMV and related entities responsible for digital ID operations, but also to private entities, such as websites, online retailers, food delivery services, parking garages, and everyone else every single time we use a digital ID for any and every purpose. Indeed, to best preserve civil liberties, we must reject and prevent an eventual scenario where daily life becomes a checkpoint society, where in person and online it becomes impossible to avoid proving our identity again and again to governments and corporations wherever we go or whatever we do. Number two, the user control of data. Related to the above concern, digital ID users should not have to reveal more personal information than necessary for the use of that ID. For example, if there's some reason a person is prompted to prove they're 21 years old or older, they should not be required to share their age, name, date of birth, and similar data for that transaction. Right now, the technology exists and is used by some to confirm one's age without revealing the underlying data mentioned. HB 78 should require only a minimum amount of data necessary for a transaction. Number three, law enforcement access to smartphones. House Bill 78 wisely bars law enforcement, among other government entities, from viewing any other content on a person's phone when a person uses a digital ID to confirm their identity. However, in the spirit of this prohibition, the ACLU of Ohio believes it should be even stronger in favor of privacy rights. In this context, we recommend further restrictions beyond just the viewing of a smartphone that include not allowing a law enforcement to offer to request even temporary possession of a smartphone. Nationally, The ACLU is aware of incidents in other states where people have quote-unquote consented to having their smartphones taken away, only to have a law enforcement officer secretly use forensic tools to copy a phone's entire contents or install spyware. That cannot and does not happen when a person maintains possession of their smartphone. Number 4, the final one for now, digital ID mandates. HB 78 anticipates the use of digital IDs for purposes such as access to government services and encounters with law enforcement, but it is silent on the use of digital IDs for potentially numerous other purposes by government and private entities. However, none of us should ignore all the possible applications that have emerged in other states and countries and will continue. Once it becomes easy enough to share one's identity with the press of a button, demands will emerge from everywhere. Accordingly, Ohio should place strict limits on the required use of digital IDs to avoid future situations where people are required to use only digital IDs. As mentioned easier, it is easy to envision demands for digital IDs to access websites, online retailers, to food delivery services, parking garages, and much more. Regulating this not only helps protect privacy, it prevents a bifurcated society that leaves behind those without smartphones, those without reliable internet access, those not eligible for digital IDs, and those without the tech savvy to navigate a society that only accommodates those with digital IDs. We see related scenarios like this already in many areas of Columbus, where if one wants to park on a city street, their exclusive option is to pay via a smartphone app. Members of this committee, you have an important responsibility here. Digital IDs are increasingly part of our current lives and will be much more so in the future. The time to get privacy protections and other policy considerations right is now, before the proverbial train entirely leaves the station. To be clear, there are more considerations and complexities than what I mentioned here today. Thankfully, Ohio is not forced to figure out all these issues on our own. Via other states and countries, there exists plenty of model language, best practices, and other helpful information to best guide how all this proceeds in our own state. As always, the ACLU of Ohio is available to help in this regard. In short, the ACLU of Ohio urges ongoing thoughtful and thorough deliberation and consideration of amended House Bill 78. We sincerely hope this committee agrees. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Daniels. I appreciate your testimony. That's very helpful. So questions from the committee? We have just a few moments. Yes, sir, Mr. Demetrio.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Daniels, for coming in. I always find it interesting when I'm nodding my head agreeing with the ACLU, but here we are. I'm sure maybe some of my colleagues on my right feel the same way. But in all seriousness, I just wanted to ask you, I got some questions about sort of consumer protection, or maybe you can call it taxpayer protection. Curious to get your thoughts here when we're talking about third parties, sort of big tech overlords handling our sensitive data. Do you think this bill goes far enough to protect taxpayers in the event of a data breach with regards to digital IDs, or do you think that we should go further? And if you have any thoughts on how we could get that done, I'd be glad to hear it.
Through the chair to Representative Demetrio, first with regard to agreeing with the ACLU, I mean, it's the core of the ACLU to be, at a minimum, skeptical of government. So we're always happy to work with people who share that outlook. Your question about data brokers and what have you, it goes beyond just data breaches. I mean, I'm from Youngstown. My father was a steel worker. We know how that went in Youngstown. But the point being that this country, by and large, in a lot of industries, used to produce things that were physical, much more. Steel, cars, things of that nature. Data is a very important thing for all kinds of reasons, financially, technologically. It is huge industries and corporations have emerged to make an awful lot of money off of our data. So data breaches, it's certainly, that's one thing at a minimum that we want to try to prevent here. But also, if you have, for instance, where a third-party data broker or brokers will be essentially running this behind the scenes for the state of Ohio, that the state of Ohio is not doing it itself. The fear is that if there are not proper privacy protections in place, no loopholes, no nothing like that, that these data brokers will try to find ways to maximize this personal information for all of us and use it for their own needs, collecting information, sending us things on our smartphone, doing things, of that nature. I mean, it's one thing to get unsolicited advertisements and everything because of how often we share our data. At the ACLU, we have a very big fear of ultimately what government might do with all this information. Think of who your, the political opponent you would least like in charge of setting these ground rules and passing these laws, and what they might do with that data. And I think it applies. There's no ideology here. It applies to, do we want our government following us to the gun store? Do we want our government following us, to a political protest or something like that? That technology exists now, and as we continue to develop technology and use it without proper safeguards, beyond even just what we're talking about right here, they increasingly become linked up. And I think there's a lot of people here that want that eventual scenario where we are tracked across multiple government and private technologies for all kinds of different uses. The problem is we don't currently have the proper privacy protections in place. So our plea again is don't leave this to the BMV to figure out. You can do this right now in the legislation, and I've let the bill sponsors know, about our requests, our testimony, and we have certainly a national expert who's written plenty and testified on this bill nationally, who I know is willing to help out in this regard. He would be much more helpful than me personally. I can certainly help to a certain degree, but he's a national expert, so I have made, the sponsors of the bill aware of this.
Yeah, thank you. Appreciate it. Now, let me move on. I only have time for 2 quick questions here. Representative, okay, that's fine. You choose. We'll take one from this side and one from this side if anybody's got one.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you also, Mr. Daniels. I have, when you were, and going back to Representative Demetriou, my question is about suggestions. Would treating this, because when you brought up do not track, and that's what really caught my attention, because I'm always checking do not track, do not track, do not track, and that's important to me. Mm-hmm. Would the suggestion treating this like an electronic medical record, where when you have your electronic medical record, that is something that no one else can have access to except for me, and just my background in that. And so would that be a suggestion where we start to treat this, putting language into this digital ID, where we treat it more like a medical record, where it's protected and it is only used just for the user, and where I share my electronic medical record in times where I'm going to the doctor, I'm sharing it but it's protected information which is not shared outside of just that scope. Would that be something that you would suggest?
Through the chair to Representative White, yes, certainly along those lines. I am no expert on the protections that are provided with medical records. I certainly know some of it and have worked on some of it, but I think you're on the right path here talking about, look, we all consider medical records something that for a variety of great reasons, many of us want to keep private, and so we have built laws specifically around that, and so we definitely need something similar here with regard to this data. No matter how unimportant some of this data, some of us are like, well, I don't care if third parties have this kind of data, but there are others of us, depending on the data, that certainly feel that way. And certainly, there are some people out there, well, if you're not doing anything wrong, what do you have to hide kind of thing. And I think that gets to I like to flip that on its head. It should not be dependent on people to explain to the government why we want our privacy protected. The burden should always be on government to explain why we need to have this information. So, I think you're on, the right path there, saying the kind of protections we have for medical records, although it's not identical here, but the thinking is the same, yes.
Thank you, appreciate that.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Collect your questions. You had some more. That's great. We'll take more next time, but please write them down. Same thing goes for that prior bill we had. You all had questions. Please write those down. We'll bring them back. Representative Ferguson, you get the last call on questions for today, please.
Thanks, Chair. Mr. Daniels, I have a lot of the same concerns. I'm an ally in being skeptical of government, as you know. Anyway, Where in line 251 it says the registrar of motor vehicles shall develop, implement, and administer a program that provides for the use of digital licenses. So my big concern here, and I was hoping you could elaborate, is for agencies or other bureaucracies to have the ability to maybe infringe on civil liberties. Do you have examples of maybe where that kind of got away from the legislature, where we gave power and civil liberties were infringed on?
Through the chair to Representative Ferguson, I mean, you know, I know one of the things that certainly makes people uncomfortable is, and I think this is still the case, apologize if it's not, but the BMV used to, or still does, you know, sell or trade our data for our driver's licenses to third parties. So, you know, the information that you're compelled to give over to the government for the purposes of a driver's license, you know, the BMV is turning around and saying, hey, you know, we're cranking this information out to a variety of other people. Certainly, if that's still the case, you know, always interested in working on, you know, bills of that type with people on both sides of the aisle, and same with drones and automatic license plate readers and facial recognition and a whole lot of other things. Digital IDs are new, you know, fairly new as a policy and as a technology. So I don't have like specific examples off the top of my head where, oh, this has gone terribly wrong in this state. The idea, of course, is to put proper protections in place so that we don't have to worry about this. Obviously, a lot of these things, the machinations of how this would all be working would be behind the scenes. You know, it's not like people would have a front row to being like, oh, look, the BMV did something wrong here with regard to how this is all operating, and is also an opportunity to go back to say, look, if you kick this all over to BMV, they're going to be coming up with things where people aren't going to have this same opportunity to come in public and say, hey, I have these concerns. It's much harder to impact policy and protections and regulations when it's done by a state agency rather than when the legislature says, hey, this is a job for us. So, you know, what we're trying to get at is not having horror stories in the first place. And I think that can be done. I think that there is a way, you know, that you can say, hey, we can have digital IDs. They're on the way. We know that, I think, as a society. But we have to get this right now to make sure that these horror stories don't emerge.
Thank you, Mr. Daniels. I really appreciate that. Some of the members are close on time, so this concludes the second hearing of House Bill 78. What I would recommend to the members from all sides here, if Mr. Daniels, if you have a moment to stay around, this can kind of card as that homework that we talked about last time. If you want to cue him, and then next time when we bring this up, and then we can share the information, that would be super helpful, because clearly this is an important topic. We appreciate your time, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.